What's the weirdest thing you've ever seen in someone's home that they acted like was totally normal? Story 1. One time I was at my friend's house, and after playing some Mario Kart or something, we wanted to go outside to play, probably around 5th grade at the time. We got downstairs to his washroom, which connects to the hallway leading outside, and the room was flooding quickly. Oh no! There was at least an inch of water covering the floor. And we called his parents, who ran in and found that their washing machine's water-depositing sink was clogged. Turns out, they also used that sink as a toilet. That very sink. All the time, like it was normal to not have a toilet and just casually use the device that is supposed to cleanse you. They said the drain was large enough to handle it, but I didn't look. That was too much for me. About a minute later, I realized that my shoes were sitting in that water as well, so I walked home barefoot with them in a plastic bag. I had to give my shoes a full funeral. Story 2. When I was 16, my family moved to a very small town, and the school there was a K to 12. I became friends with a girl whose father was a pastor at one of the local churches. We went over to her house after school, and she introduced me to her mom, her older brother, and her dad. We then went back to her room to hang out. It was a particularly hot and humid day, so she stripped down to her bra and underwear and didn't put any other clothes on. I thought it was a little odd, but whatever. She seemed comfortable. She asked me if I wanted a snack or something. I said yes, so she said, "Let's go to the kitchen." I thought for sure she would put on some clothes since we were about to go out where her family was, but nope. We went to the kitchen, where the rest of her family was, and no one seemed at all fazed by the fact that their sister, was walking around in her underwear. She even sat on her older brother's lap at one point. It isn't as wild as some of the other stories people share, but I thought it was pretty strange at the time. Story 3. I was walking through town with my buddy once, and we suddenly ran into one of his friends. A guy he hadn't seen in several years. The usual small talk ensued, and he said, "Why don't you guys come to my house for a coffee or something?" Since he lived in the city, we figured why not, and walked and talked back to his place. When we got there, it was a mess. Not necessarily filthy in the sense of dirt and grime, but there were objects everywhere. The sink piled high with cutlery, toys, and other stuff from his son, absolutely everywhere. Total disarray. This guy also had a dog, and the place smelled off. He offered us both a cup of coffee, and quickly noticed, no surprise, that there were no clean cups. So what did he do? Picked up 2 mugs from the coffee table, which was barely visible under the junk, and no word of a lie, he put them down in front of his dog. Let the dog lick the remaining coffee out of the cups, then legit started making coffee in them, without washing them. Needless to say, we both just sat there holding the cups, pretending to sip now and then. We left soon after. He acted like it was the most normal thing in the world. Story 4. Have you ever been inside the home of someone with OCD? The lady who used to live across the street from us had OCD. At 7 a.m., she would come out of the house with perfect hair and makeup and begin her daily routine. Her lawn was immaculate. The grass was cut with this incredibly expensive lawnmower, something you'd expect to see used on a golf course. The curb was lined with bricks, and she would go down the curb with a toothbrush and clean between the bricks every single day. She would even sweep her grass. Her son wasn't allowed to play on it. The shrubs and flowers were perfectly trimmed. The first time I visited her home, I was afraid to move. I remember looking at the rug in the entryway, which we were not allowed to step on. The tassels on the ends of the rug had been perfectly straightened out. It looked like they had been ironed. You would never have guessed that a child lived in that house. It must have been pretty difficult for him. Story 5. I remember going over to a classmate's house. I can't remember, but I think her name was Susie. Doesn't matter, she'll be Susie for this story, when I was around 10 or 11. Susie didn't have many friends, so my mom arranged with Susie's mom for me to sleep over at their house. The family was a little unusual in a few ways. First, they called each other by their family roles. They always said mother, father, or sister. Like, "Can you pass the butter, sister?" Susie told me they had rented some movies for the sleepover. Great, I thought. But in reality, they rented one movie and watched it back-to-back 3 times. Darby O'Gill and the Little People. Then Susie said, if I wanted, I could take a bath because they didn't have a shower. I said sure, but when she showed me the bathroom, the tub already had water in it. She said, I should have asked you earlier, but I forgot. We're supposed to let guests go first. If you want, I can go after you, though. So, yeah, the family shared the same bath water. I politely avoided the bath and mentally counted down the minutes until my mom came to pick me up the next morning. Oh, and the mom put mayonnaise in the mashed potatoes. Story 6. Sadly, it wasn't even someone else's house. It was the flat I lived in with 3 other people. I was friends with 2 of them, and the third was a girl who joined when we were searching for a new flatmate. She seemed like a really nice, bubbly person. After about 2 months of her being there, we noticed kitchen stuff going missing. It was easy to tell because the kitchen was overloaded with things to the point that cupboards wouldn't close properly. Anyway, cutlery, plates, bowls, and glasses started disappearing. I mentioned it to the others, and they said they'd noticed too but couldn't explain it. We asked the new girl, who said she had no idea where the stuff was, and blamed the previous girl who had lived with us. I saw her moving out with loads of stuff. About 2 months later, there were 0 bowls and very little cutlery and plates left in the kitchen, so I lost it and went into this girl's room. The place was disgusting, a complete mess. The room was so covered in stuff that you couldn't see the floor. Piles of empty kebab, pizza, and chicken boxes. Tampon applicators on the floor. I turned the place over and found bowl after bowl, plate after plate. All the stuff that had gone missing. All of it was dirty and moldy, and some of the cutlery was rusty. It was revolting. The weirdest thing was a dirty plate with a pile of mustard on it, left on the bed and under the covers. We confronted her about it, and she broke down crying and left the flat the following week. Story 7. In 4th grade, I stayed overnight for the first time at a friend's house. His whole family was super nice and gave us free rein of this huge farm they lived on. They had 3-wheelers, go-karts, dirt bikes, and jet skis for the pond out back. The place was amazing. Anyway, it didn't get weird until the next morning. We slept outside in tents. I woke up last and ran into the house to find my friend, and I froze when I got to the kitchen. There, either sitting at or standing by the table, was his whole family. Him, his mom, dad, older brother, and 2 older sisters. Each of them was wearing a plain white t-shirt, and nothing else. Completely uncovered. His mom told me to take a seat. Breakfast was almost ready. I sat down, and she walked over with a plate, completely casual, and asked if I had fun last night. I mumbled something and tried to play it cool. Everyone was walking around, getting food, hugging each other, and talking about the day like being half-dressed was totally normal. I never said anything to my buddy, and I actually stayed over at his place pretty often all the way through high school. Besides all the cool stuff they had, his mom and sisters were very attractive. Story 8. When I was 8 years old, I was friends with a girl from my neighborhood. This was back when people thought nothing of letting a group of 8-year-old girls walk through the neighborhood alone to see friends within a few blocks. Usually, we never played inside but hung around the small playground nearby. One day, we were at the playground when it started to drizzle, so the girl offered to let us come to her house to play. We were excited because she had an Atari, so we happily agreed. The whole family had this white blonde, almost albino-like hair. The girl, her brothers, her mother, and her father. Her mother was a chubby woman with red cheeks who seemed nice and gave us some cookies. We played Atari in the living room for a while, and then the girl took us up to her bedroom. Before we got there, we walked down a hallway with a tall bookcase. She stopped to show us picture books that her dad shared with her. She said they were for the games they played. Inside the books, which were just magazines, were glossy photos of unclothed men and women in unusual positions. The girl told us her dad would show her those, and sometimes they would act out the scenes. She asked if any of us did the same things with our families, or if our dads ever showed us his thing. She didn't know if it was wrong, but she said it made her feel strange. She also said that one day, after they had played those games, she noticed a brown stain in her underwear, but didn't know if it was something serious. It was the late 70s, and I was 8 years old. I had no idea what that was all about. I had a sense that something was wrong, but you just didn't go home and tell your parents these kinds of things. Many years later, when I recalled the scene, I was horrified, but by that time, I was no longer in contact with her. I always wonder what happened to her. The memory haunts me to this day. Story 9. I hadn't thought of this for many years, but it's a good story. I was working as a telemarketer at a large call center around the year 2000. Basically, everyone there were huge cannabis users, including myself. After work, I went with this guy I didn't really know to a run-down little apartment to buy a bag from him. He started showing me some of his stuff, the most interesting of which was a bazooka. I'm talking about a real shoulder-launch, World War II-looking bazooka. It got even weirder when his girlfriend showed up. She looked a bit unwell, and just as I was trying to do the old, "Oh, wow, look at the time, I should head out," routine, an older guy pulled up. Turns out it was the girl's father, whom she had never met before. Tears and clichés followed like, "It's so nice to have a face to go along with the voice," etc. I was far too overwhelmed for that situation and got out of there as quickly as I could. Story 10. I was dating an Asian girl, and like many Asian families, extended relatives seemed to share a large house. There were my girlfriend's grandparents, her mother, her aunt, and her cousin all living there. I had been to the house a few times, and I guess I hadn't noticed the lights always being on, but this was the first night I slept over. They had their bedroom lights off, but every other light in the house was turned on. I asked my girlfriend why they left all the lights on. Apparently, because they were using energy-saving bulbs, they believed that keeping them on would somehow save electricity and reduce their bill. I explained to my girlfriend that this logic made no sense. She understood when I told her, but she never mentioned it to her family because she wasn't allowed to correct her elders or tell them they were wrong. Story 11. My first unusual childhood experience happened when I went over to a kid's house, let's call him Cletus, to play Xbox. First thing that happened when we got there was his uncle calling us over to the couch outside on the lawn. He wanted to show us the mess that his niece, Cletus's sister, had made on the couch. There was a certain item sitting next to him, and the first thing Cletus did when he saw it was touch it, sniff his finger, and laugh. I was completely stunned. He then showed me his pit bull, which they kept chained up in the backyard. It must have been trained to be aggressive, because it was extremely hostile, and they kept antagonizing it with a baseball bat. After that, I made an excuse to leave and got out of there. I never talked to Cletus again. It wasn't hard to avoid him since he dropped out of school shortly afterward. This all happened during middle school. Story 12. I once stayed the night at my great-grandmother's house. She and her husband were incredibly old and had separate bedrooms, probably because at that age they just wanted some peace and quiet. Anyway, they decided to sleep in the same bed that night so I could have a room to myself. It was a cinder block house that smelled like old age, biscuit dough, collard greens, and sweet tea. As I lay in bed that night, I kept the lamp on and let my eyes wander the room. There were what felt like 1,000 pictures on the wall of my great-grandfather, family members, his friends, and a bunch of people I didn't recognize. Everything was dusty, the sheets felt ancient, and they smelled like someone had tried to wash them, but didn't quite succeed. They kept the house at what felt like 103 degrees at all times, so between the heat and the smell, I couldn't sleep. I tried to open a window and saw it had been painted shut over and over again. While standing there, I noticed something shiny under the bed, and curiosity got the best of me. I knelt down and pulled out the object, and then I heard a sloshing sound. It was a chamber pot. Of course, these people had grown up in a completely different time. Inside, floating in the golden liquid, were two of the thickest, most fibrous objects I'd ever seen. How my great-grandfather managed to pass those is beyond comprehension. The motion of lifting the pot caused the contents to shift, and the smell hit me full force. I gagged and ended up throwing up into the same container. I didn't know what else to do, so I slid the pot back under the bed and slept in the living room, claiming I had fallen asleep reading. I only went back for Christmas after that. Story 13. In college, I was casually dating a guy. Neither of us ever implied to anyone that it was a serious relationship. One weekend, he invited me to his parents' house since he knew I lived in a rough apartment with problematic roommates, the kind who gave each other haircuts in the living room and didn't clean up afterward, and nothing but ramen noodles and bugs to keep me company. I met his parents, who seemed nice enough, and they said they would be hanging out in the living room while he and I made dinner in the kitchen. While we were chatting about celebrity crushes or something lighthearted, his mom suddenly shouted that her baby boy may not be perfect, but at least he's circumcised. I laughed awkwardly, pretending I didn't know anything about that, wondering where she was going with this. Then she said, "I can prove it if you don't believe me." I looked at him. He didn't seem too fazed, so I looked back at her, and she pulled a jar out of the cupboard. Yes, it was a jar containing his foreskin, a 20-year-old preserved keepsake, just sitting in the kitchen cupboard. Totally normal. Story 14. I'm going to flip the prompt and tell a story that I considered normal at the time, but everyone else thought was weird. When I was about 14, I lived in my parents' finished basement. My room was in the back. I began noticing that bees, specifically yellow jackets, were getting into my room pretty often, like several per day. I had a drop ceiling and noticed they were coming from the light sockets, so I lifted a tile and found that they had made a nest in the ceiling. I told my mom, and she said she would call an exterminator. Fast forward about 5 months, still no exterminator. I was used to it. There were bees flying around 24/7, and I didn't even give them a second thought. I was practically living in a beehive. One day, I was in my room playing whatever video game I was into at the time, probably SOCOM 3, and I heard my mom coming down the stairs toward my room. I valued my privacy, and she knew that, so she rarely came in. She walked in, saw the swarm of bees, and just freaked out. I wasn't allowed back in my room for nearly a week while they dealt with the infestation. I had told her at least once a week about the bee problem, but she hadn't seen it herself and assumed it was just a small nest with the occasional bee getting through. Nope, my room was the hive. Surprisingly, I didn't get stung even once. I think it had to do with how calm I was around them. Story 15. When I was recruiting for the military, a couple came to my office because they wanted their son to join. They invited me over for dinner, and being a bachelor in my 20s, I wasn't about to turn down a home-cooked meal. I got their address and told them I'd be over at 6. I arrived during a torrential downpour and realized they had no grass or walkway. I trudged through the mud, thankful I was wearing combat boots, and knocked on the front door. While waiting, I noticed not only did the house not have siding, But it also seemed to be made entirely out of cheap plywood, those compressed wood chips glued together. I figured they were renovating and that the inside would be fine. Oh boy, was I wrong. When they opened the door, I was hit with the smell of old cigarette smoke, as if 3 people were smoking 5 packs a day indoors. I stepped in and had to carefully navigate piles of junk everywhere. There weren't even paths cleared. You had to step around everything like you were playing The Floor is Lava. But the goal was to actually find floor space. While stepping through, I noticed that the entire house, walls, ceiling, and floor, was made of that same cheap plywood. Since it was raining, the wood was soaking up water and causing the ceiling to sag. I kid you not, the ceiling was sagging by about 2 feet. The whole time I was there, I kept thinking, when this place collapses, what's the fastest way out? As I navigated through the house, I also realized there wasn't a single door anywhere. The closest thing to a door was a sheet hanging over the bathroom entry. They showed me to the kitchen, where the mom was just starting dinner, with a burning cigarette hanging out of her mouth, ashes falling wherever. She pulled a dirty pan from the sink and wiped it with a rag. No water, no soap, just the same dirty rag. She started cooking some pork chops, and I thought, okay, I've heard of people who don't wash pans to preserve flavor. It's weird, but not unheard of. While she cooked, the roof started leaking, and the dad kept getting up to put buckets under the leaks, talking to me like it was no big deal. When dinner was ready, and we were waiting for their son to show up, I watched as the mom pulled dirty dishes from the sink, wiped them with that same rag, and placed them on the table. She did the same with the silverware. I held it together, but I nearly lost it. Still, I smiled politely. Eventually, the son showed up. He had a 2-foot purple mohawk and 37 tattoos. I interviewed him, and he wanted to join, so I started reviewing his eligibility. He met all the basic requirements. I just needed to talk to him about the tattoos. About 5 were acceptable. 2 I didn't see because I wasn't about to check certain areas, but the rest had to go. There were anarchy symbols, an upside-down cross with numbers, messages against law enforcement, you name it. It would have been less strange if he were in his 20s and living on his own, but he was 17, still living at home, and apparently allowed to do whatever he wanted. I told him which tattoos would need to be removed, including the ones on his face, and figured I'd be on my way. Not so fast. He asked how to remove tattoos, and I told him he should speak to a doctor. He responded, I heard lemon juice can remove them. I said, probably not. Then his dad handed me a beer and said, let's chat. He started telling me stories about being an enforcer for drug cartels in Colombia in the 80s. As he went into extreme detail about violent events, the son walked in, asked his mom for lemon juice, poured it into a tattoo needle, and began trying to remove his tattoos right there. Eventually, I tried to excuse myself, but the dad insisted on showing me his gun collection. Given the situation, I didn't argue. He took me outside to the garage. And here's the twist. The garage was completely normal. It had a perfect roof, siding, solid doors, and everything was finished and painted. I've never figured out why they had a beautiful 3-stall garage while living in such chaos. Story 16. Somewhere around 6th grade, I stayed over at a friend's house for the first time. It was my first sleepover since moving to a new state. We did the usual outdoor stuff. Chased his sister around and blew things up with firecrackers, since his family ran a fireworks stand and had tons of them. When it came time to sleep, we headed downstairs to the kids' area. Downstairs was basically just a playroom and bedroom for the kids. My friend asked me if I wanted to see something cool. He lifted a plywood sheet in the middle of the room to reveal a big hole. They were digging a tunnel to the outside. The parents knew about it and didn't care at all. They had busted through the foundation and made a tunnel about 10 feet long. Two things. There was no support in the tunnel whatsoever. And my friend casually mentioned, yeah, a ton of spiders get in through the hole too. Hobo spiders. Big, venomous, aggressive spiders. I didn't sleep well that night. Story 17. While I was in grad school, I worked part-time walking dogs for a small local business. They offered dog walking, daycare, obedience classes, you name it. I love animals, and it got me outside for study breaks. It was a great job, except for one house. I showed up for the first time at this house, and the dog owners weren't there, which was normal. I'd been given a key, and according to the client notes, I was supposed to walk 2 dogs. Only one greeted me at the door, so I looked around for the other. Nothing. The rest of the house was practically empty. I was supposed to give the dogs treats, too, so when I walked through the kitchen, I searched for those. I eventually found the milk bones in the fridge, along with a 2-liter soda, a bottle of ketchup, and a bottle of mustard. That was the only food in the house. I took the first dog for a walk, thinking the other one might come out while I was gone. I came back, still no second dog, but I noticed a basement door, so I went down calling the dog's name. There were no lights down there, so I had to rely on what light filtered in from the top of the stairs. I saw a litter box on the stair landing and glanced inside. It was full, but there were no cats or any signs of cats in the house. I stepped into the basement and into ankle-deep piles of something soft and spongy. I was seriously creeped out, but thought I heard a rustle, so I waded further in and kept calling the dog. Now I was around the corner from the stairs, and it was very dim. Just as I was about to give up, something brushed my face. I ran out of there faster than I've ever moved in my life. I had to go back to that house the next week, and I genuinely thought I might end up in some basement pit, like something out of a horror movie. Story 18. This might be a bit of a stretch for this post, but when I was around 12, I went to a friend's house. I noticed that we were starting to drift apart. I'd go over and we'd play Xbox, but by then he was more into hunting and soccer, and I had become a full-on gamer. This visit turned out to be the last one. It was a little strained. He got bored of Xbox pretty quickly and went outside, while I stayed in his room and kept playing. He came back in, wearing only basketball shorts, and not sure how we got there, but he ended up dry humping me through his shorts and my jeans. We were both guys. Then his parents got home, we slept, and I left the next morning like nothing happened. He came to my house one more time, but we never talked about it. His mom has been my bus driver since 7th grade, and I'm currently a junior in high school. He's a grade behind me, and when he came to the same school and rode the same bus, we kept our distance. Now I have a class with him, and he constantly jokes with his group of like-minded rural friends in the back of the room, making a lot of "that's weird" jokes. He's also friends with some of my friends, but when he talks to them, he sort of avoids looking at me. He did once, and for the first time since I've seen him in high school, he wasn't smiling. He looked kind of hurt. Now I keep debating whether I should finally talk to him 3 years after that incident. I've seen a lot of his family, and, well, I don't think his dad would be supportive if he came out, though his mom is extremely kind. The other possibility is that he's straight, and I was just a one-time curiosity for him. Story 19. One of my very best friends growing up lived in a really old house. They had a fire pit in the yard that they used to burn garbage. Apparently, they had a permit. I don't know. Also, their water was permanently rust-colored. The dishes in the dishwasher came out rust-colored. It was just a fact of life. They were used to it. But that's not the weirdest thing. The toilet was coated in black. It was caked with years and years of accumulated rusty water, urine, and waste. The entire interior of the bowl was coated with a thick black layer of residue. The toilet never really flushed. They would pour a bucket of water in, which would gradually drain the bowl. I tried to avoid ever using it for anything major, but one day I didn't have a choice. The worst part was the smell. Imagine the last 10 times you used the bathroom, but all at once. Yeah, shortly before they moved, they replaced that old toilet. It sat outside in the yard for a while. Story 20. I had a friend whose parents were hoarders. They had stuff everywhere, literally. Their dining room was the litter box for their 13 dogs and 7 cats. They also didn't seem to understand what a garbage can was, and had piles upon piles of trash all over. You can't imagine the smell. None of the animals were neutered, which meant almost every time I visited, there was a new litter of kittens or puppies. One time, the smell was even worse than usual. Turns out a newborn kitten had gotten trapped behind a dresser and passed away. They only looked for it when the house started to smell like something had died. I cried. One of my favorite dogs they had was named Junior. I met him the day he was born, and we bonded. Every time I walked in the door, Junior would run over to me. I begged my mom to let me have him. I even brought him home once to see if maybe she'd fall in love with him too. But she didn't. One night I went over, and Junior didn't greet me. He had been hit by a car, and because they didn't have money or resources, they didn't take him to a vet. They just made him a bed and let him lie there in pain until he passed away in their living room. He survived 4 days in agony before he finally passed. I cried again. There was also a cat named Tippy Toes. He was a male cat and very old. I have no idea how he lived so long, considering the poor care they gave all their animals. One day, I went to pet him and saw that he was in serious pain because he had a severe medical issue. It was so bad that part of his body dragged behind him as he walked. They didn't do anything about it. I cried over that cat, too. I begged someone to help him. Out of a house of 5 people, not one stepped up to end the poor animal's suffering. He walked around like that for a month, until one day he just never came home. I feel incredibly ashamed for not calling Animal Protective Services, or CPS. There's a lot more to the story, but I should have done something. All I know is I loved all those animals, and every time I came over, I petted each and every one of them for at least 5 minutes before even saying hello to anyone else. I know they loved me too. I wish I could have taken them all. Story 21. I guess it's not weird, just disgusting. This couple I knew was nice enough to let me move in with them for a few months. They had an 8-month-old baby. It turns out the house was filthy. Moldy food and half-filled, moldy cans of soda. Eggs sitting in the living room for a week. All of this around a crawling baby who would eat whatever was on the floor. The wife even yelled at me one time for wasting food when there were blueberries on the ground that had been stepped on and the baby had eaten them, covered in dirt. Their microwave was caked in food. The toilet, which was supposed to be white, was black and covered in hair. They thought there was nothing wrong with their housekeeping. I never cooked there because the sink was filled with moldy water and bugs. It was truly awful. Since moving out, I've turned into a clean freak, almost obsessively. Story 22. This girl I was seeing turned out to be a hoarder. I met her at a local bar. She was cute, funny, and had a great personality. The first few times we hooked up, she came back to my place. She kept begging to go back to hers, and one night I gave in because she said she had a Wii and wanted to play Mario Kart and Super Smash Bros. I was excited. I thought I had found someone worth my time. Nope. We got back to her place, and she was living upstairs in a relative's house. It looked like a nice place, at least downstairs. It was clean and well kept. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when she opened the door to her room. All I could see was cats and a mountain of trash. There were half-eaten fast food sandwiches, candy wrappers, junk, clothes, pet waste, and who knows what else. The sight was bad. but the smell was even worse. There was a narrow path leading to a heavily stained mattress, also covered in food wrappers and cats. I asked her if this was seriously her room or some kind of prank. She replied, "What? It's just a little messy. I haven't had time to clean this week. I've been working." Now, I was pretty drunk at that point, but I still had enough sense to get out of there. I told her I left my phone and charger in her car. They were actually in my jacket, and I asked for her keys so I could grab them. She gave me the keys, and I left them by the front door as I made my escape. I had second thoughts for a moment, remembering it was 5 degrees outside and there was a foot of snow on the sidewalk. She lived over 4 miles from my place, but then I remembered that room, the smell, and I pulled myself together and made the worst walk home of my life. Story 23. I've been waiting to tell this one for a long time. I do yard work during the summer for an older couple. They're both really nice, but the wife is a bit eccentric. She's a big cat person and usually has 7 or 8 running around at any time. One day, I got dropped off and she told me I'd be digging a cat grave. She had a cat that was probably going to pass away soon due to organ failure, so I figured I was digging the grave in advance. Well, after I finished, I was chatting with the husband, and he told me why I really dug the grave. It wasn't for the cat that was about to pass. It was for the cats that had already died. Apparently, the ground was too hard to dig in late fall when the cats had died. So, in order to give them a proper burial, they preserved them in their freezer. He took me down to the basement and opened the freezer, and there they were. To the right of the Ben & Jerry's, but above the frozen meat, were 2 dead, frozen cats. Story 24. I had a friend whose house was absolutely disgusting. First, there was a hole in the wall in his bedroom. It formed because they had a window AC unit that leaked, and eventually the drywall collapsed and left a moldy hole. There was garbage and junk everywhere. Cans, bottles, dirty dishes. Whenever I went over, I refused to take my shoes off. I stayed the night several times on weekends and always kept my shoes on and slept on the couch. They didn't use sheets on their beds, and the mattresses were brown. The final straw, the moment I decided I would never sleep there again, was when he wanted to make eggs. He went to get their electric griddle, which was covered in dried food and grime. Normally, we never ate there. We'd walk to a gas station and grab something late at night. But he really wanted eggs. Me and another friend stood there watching, wondering if he would clean the griddle. He decided it was too dirty to cook on, so he picked up a crusty sock from the floor and wiped it down with that, a dirty sock. We both immediately said nope and walked to the gas station. He never understood what the problem was. Story 25. To explain the weirdest thing I ever saw in someone's house, I need to give you a little background. Maybe most people here aren't used to eating codfish the way we do in Portugal. We buy it preserved in salt, and then we have to soak it in water for a couple of days before cooking. We usually do this in the kitchen, which makes sense. It's where food belongs, right? Apparently not for a colleague of mine. One day, we had to prepare a group project and went to her house. At some point, I needed to use the bathroom. You can imagine the look on my face when I saw the shower curtain open and, inside the bathtub, a big bowl soaking codfish. That's right. She was preparing food in the bathroom. Thankfully, that was the last group project we did together, and I never had to go back to her house. I still wonder what other weird stuff she had going on. Oh, and even though this happened 4 years ago, my friends and I still call her the Codfish Girl. Story 26. I'm pretty late to this thread, but I've got a good one. It was the beginning of summer, and I was at a party at my friend's house. Let's call him Fred. It was a big party. His parents were gone, and his house was in the perfect spot. After a while, I had to use the bathroom. I checked 2 of them, but they were both occupied, so I went upstairs. That's when I found the master bathroom. I was thrilled. It was basically mine for the night, and I used it every time. But what threw me off, the reason I'm telling this story, was what was directly above the toilet. A full plaster mold of Fred's pregnant mother's torso. Yes, the entire front. I told some close friends at the party, and within 20 minutes, there were about 15 of us crammed into that bathroom, laughing and teasing Fred. I'll never forget it. Story 27. I went out with this one girl a few times. I hadn't seen her apartment until about a month into dating. She was a single mom, so I expected some toys and clutter. No big deal. But her apartment was absolutely filthy. The kitchen looked like it had never been cleaned. There were splatters on the walls and floors near the stove. The sink was stacked high with dishes that looked like they'd been there since the 80s. The small kitchen table was covered in more dishes, papers, and random items I couldn't even identify. The living room was just as bad. The couch was covered in crumbs from various snacks. The rug was barely visible, buried under spills, stains, dirty clothes, used diapers, thankfully folded, toys, papers, and pet hair. Surprisingly, the bathroom was clean. That made me wonder if anyone even used it to bathe. She wanted to watch a movie, so we sat on the couch. She brushed off the crumbs with her hand and made some comment about her messy kid. We got 20 minutes into the movie, but my allergies were flaring up badly. I'm usually fine with cats, but it felt like there was dander in every inch of the place. I didn't even see a cat. I told her I needed to run to CVS for allergy meds and just left. When she texted me later, I told her I wasn't feeling well and went home. I said the meds made me drowsy, so I wouldn't have to keep talking. I ignored her calls and messages after that, and eventually, she got the hint. Fast forward 10 years. She's had 2 more kids with 2 different guys. I can only imagine what her place looks like now. Story 28. My high school boyfriend's older brother, who was 18 and a senior, slept on a bare mattress in the middle of the living room. His clothes were in a pile next to the computer desk, which was placed in what I assume was originally meant to be a dining room, since it was right next to the kitchen. But in that dining room space, there was only the computer, his clothes, and a stack of books. And the living room wasn't his room. It was the shared common area of the household, yet it was also where he slept. The mom and my boyfriend, who was 16, had their own rooms, and the 2 younger brothers shared a bedroom. To this day, I still have no idea why the oldest brother lived like that. One of the first times I ever visited their house, I saw him sleeping on the mattress in the living room. I had noticed the mattress before, but it had been propped up against the wall, so I figured they were moving it or something. I must have been staring too long, confused, because my boyfriend kind of shook his head in annoyance and said, "Don't ask," before quickly shuffling me into his room. Other times, when I came over, Brandon would be sleeping in the living room while their mom sat on the couch watching TV or reading, and the younger brothers would be playing or doing homework. They all just lived their lives around him, sleeping on a mattress in the living room, and never once talked about it. Story 29. This was probably back in 2000 or so. I was into pro wrestling back then, and I went to a friend's house to watch a WWF pay-per-view. I'll call him Mike. This was the first time I'd ever been to his house. He usually came to mine. I expected it to be weird or messy or something, but it was actually a totally normal house. To the best of my knowledge, it was just me, Mike, and his mom there. At one point, his mom yelled from the kitchen, "Rachel, did you take out the trash?" And Mike answered back, "No." Now, I never left the living room, so it's possible someone else was there. I know he had 2 sisters, and I think one still lived at home. I didn't see her, and I didn't know their names, so I just assumed Rachel was his sister and that Mike was answering for her, knowing she hadn't taken out the trash. But a while later, His mom called out to Rachel again. And again, Mike answered. That's when I started wondering, was his mom calling him Rachel? I tried not to dwell on it, but later she addressed Rachel again, and once more, Mike responded. I went home that night still confused. Maybe it was some inside joke or she was teasing him, trying to embarrass him in front of me. I never asked. Fast forward a year or two later, Mike asked me for a ride home. I took him, and he invited me inside. He and his mom got into an argument. I guess she was supposed to pick him up. They were both upset, and she looked at him and said something like, Rach, I told you I couldn't pick you up. Again, years later, she called him Rachel. To this day, I have no idea what that was about. I lost contact with him a long time ago, so I don't think I'll ever get an answer. Story 30. Not sure if this qualifies, but here goes. When I was about 8 or 9, I went to play at a friend's house and I found her parents a bit unsettling, especially her dad, who came across as aggressive and provocative. Her mother just sat in the kitchen, smoking and yelling at her younger siblings, who were completely out of control. Later on, my friend confided that her father used to physically hurt her on a regular basis. I remember us playing house, and at one point, she decided that the mom had died and the dad was suddenly in a relationship with the daughter. At the time, I remember thinking it was odd, but I was a very insecure child and didn't say anything. After that day, we didn't hang out anymore. I occasionally spoke to her when we were older. When we were around 14, she told me in confidence that she was pregnant and planning to have an abortion. I knew she wasn't dating anyone, and she never told me who the father was. Not long after that, she was pregnant again and had a miscarriage. She also struggled with eating disorders. It wasn't until recently, about 10 years later, that I looked back on that childhood memory of playing house and realized just how disturbing it really was. The fact that an 8-year-old imagined something like that as normal still creeps me out. Story 31. One of my best friends in high school lived in a house that was a complete mess. His mom was a hoarder. It wasn't to the level you see on TV. There weren't blocked doorways or anything like that, but it was definitely heading in that direction. Most of the tables in the house were unusable because of all the stuff stacked on top of them. The computer room was filled with Mickey Mouse memorabilia. Their basement was a complete nightmare. Half the space was wall-to-wall pink boxes, each one containing a different doll. In another corner of the room, there were 2 massive shelves holding DVDs of nearly every major movie released since the 1980s, many of them still unopened. Honestly, the strangest thing in the house was in the main floor bathroom. It was just big enough to fit a toilet and a sink. On the wall directly across from the toilet was a large crucifix made from a mirror-like material. So basically, if you had to use the bathroom there, you had to look at your own reflection while sitting beneath a reflective image of a suffering Jesus. Nobody ever seemed to find this odd. Story 32. Once, I was at my cousin's house, and they mentioned they were dealing with an ant problem. That seemed understandable, and I didn't think much of it. I saw a few ant traps placed around the house and figured the issue was under control. When it came time for dinner, we sat down to eat, and I spotted an ant on the table. Normally, if I were at home, I'd pause everything, move the food, kill the ant, and check the area for more before continuing. But instead, I just pointed out the ant to my cousin, aunt, and uncle. All they said was, "Oh." So in my head, I thought, okay, it's just one ant, no big deal. Then I started noticing more. Before long, there were nearly a dozen ants crawling around the table. My cousin and his family just kept eating like it was completely normal, even as ants were moving under and around the plates. Maybe they had grown used to it since the issue had apparently been going on for weeks. But personally, I was pretty grossed out eating food with ants crawling all around us. Story 33. My friend Rob and I were 17 when we went to visit a girl he liked. Martha. We met her parents and her little 4-year-old sister, and everyone seemed perfectly normal at first. Martha already had another friend over, so we all went to hang out in her bedroom, which was large enough for everyone. Out of nowhere, her little sister came running in, jumped on the bed, and then immediately fell off, hitting her head on the bedpost. She started crying loudly. Her dad came running into the room and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Which one of you hit her? Which one of you hit her?" Rob and I immediately stepped back, completely shocked, and had no idea what to say. We just stood there, mumbling and confused. It was one of the longest and most uncomfortable 15 seconds of my life. Then, out of nowhere, her dad smiled, calmed down, and started laughing. Martha just tapped him on the shoulder with a slightly annoyed look and said nothing, like this was a regular thing. He picked up his daughter and walked out of the room, leaving Rob and me speechless. Martha casually said, "Oh, my dad is so weird." Rob and I made an excuse about needing to go home and left shortly afterward. We didn't know what to think or how to feel about any of it. Story 34. I once knew a guy who had what he called a dump room. Basically, every time he filled a trash bag, he'd tie it up and throw it into that room. The one time I visited his house, the garbage was piled shoulder-high throughout the entire room. This wasn't public housing. It was a proper Georgian home in a nice area, probably worth over €1,000,000. When I asked him what he'd do when the room was full, he just said he didn't know, but that his father would take care of it. He also couldn't understand why I, or anyone else, found the concept of a dump room so bizarre. The rest of the house was filthy too, and strange. He had an oven in his bedroom and one room that was literally just a bath. The door opened outward, and the entire space was taken up by the tub. No floor space at all. And if that wasn't odd enough, his uncle, who had once been in a psychiatric facility, lived in the basement. He claimed he hadn't seen him in 3 years. Story 35. Not the most horrifying story, but I was young and easily terrified. I had just made my first friend at a new school. She was new too. We finally planned a sleepover at her house, and I had no idea I was about to step into what felt like a horror film. Her parents were taxidermists and also collected horror movie memorabilia. Her dad had mounted buffalo skulls on the walls, and there was a giant alligator head atop the living room TV. Stuffed rodents and bats greeted me as I walked up the stairs to her room. The scariest part came in the middle of the night. The only hallway to the upstairs bathroom passed by a loft where they had a life-size horror doll and replica torture props from famous horror movies. The doll had a motion sensor and would speak as you walked by. And keep in mind, it was pitch black in the house when this happened. Her parents, despite their cigarette-smoking, leather-wearing, dead animal-collecting lifestyle, were actually super kind and well-liked by my own strict parents. Nowadays, they'd probably be those quirky, cool parents in a sitcom, but back then, they scared the life out of me. Story 36. I had a step-cousin I was close with when I was younger. He lived in Florida, and we went to visit him and our extended family. One night, I stayed over at a friend's house with him. The first thing the mother said to me when I walked in was, "Don't mind the cockroaches, they don't hurt." I started looking around and realized there were thousands of inch-long cockroaches everywhere. Being an awkward 11-year-old, I just forced myself to act like it was fine. We went to the kitchen, and they were crawling out of the dishwasher, where my friend pulled out cups for us to use. They also had a boa constrictor that supposedly helped eat them. We played video games on the living room TV while roaches crawled across the screen. But the worst part was sleeping. I slept in a chair after brushing off as many of them as I could. But all night, I kept waking up to flick them off my arms, legs, and face. I assumed it was just a temporary problem, but 10 years later, I asked my cousin about it, and he said it had always been like that. I still don't understand how they lived that way. Story 37. I think this one takes the cake, but it's probably going to get buried. In this case, it was my family that had weird stuff we thought was normal, until someone else pointed it out. When I was a kid living in Missouri, somewhere between ages 4 to 7, my family got some dolls and wooden toys from a family friend. They looked like playful children with odd hairstyles, holding slices of watermelon, and there was even a pencil-style sketch of a child in a cart being pulled by an older man with the caption, "Giddy-ap, Grandpa." As a kid, I thought the toys were cute and harmless. But years later, when I was about 17 or 18, my sister brought her friend over, who happened to be black. We were hanging out in the living room watching TV when her friend went into the kitchen, where the toys were displayed. She came back and shouted, "Are you guys serious? Is this for real?" My sister and I were wide-eyed and confused until we realized what she was talking about. The toys weren't just old-fashioned. They were racially offensive caricatures. The grandpa wasn't a grandpa at all. He was clearly meant to be a slave, and the kid had a whip in his hand. We were mortified. We had never looked at them that way because we didn't know better. We got rid of the toys and the picture immediately. It was a painful but important lesson. Story 38. One time, I was staying with a friend in Leeds for a few nights. I went out one evening with another guy I vaguely knew at the time, got very drunk, went home with a random girl, and left the next morning to walk back to my friend's house. I tried calling the whole way there, but he wasn't answering his phone or the door, and I had no way of getting inside. So I just stood around for the next hour or so, completely out of ideas. Some random guy came around the corner and started walking up the street. He looked like he'd just come from a rave or disco. This was 2009, so that style was popular. He walked up to one house and began knocking really hard on the door. It wasn't violent, but more impatient and restless. Nobody answered. After about 20 seconds, he turned around and started talking to me. Now, I'm terrible with names, so I can't recall anyone's real name in this story. We'll call this guy Dave. Dave asked me for my name. I told him, and he replied, "Cool, I'm Dave." That's when I realized he was definitely on something, likely ecstasy. He asked me why I was standing on the street in the middle of the day doing nothing, so I explained the situation. He then invited me into this random house with random people I'd never met before. The same house nobody had answered at a moment ago. I was hesitant, but it was cold. Leeds in February is brutal when you're in just a t-shirt and jeans. And I needed to charge my phone, so I agreed. As soon as I accepted, the door opened. Dave practically ran in to greet the friend who'd answered. The guy looked like your typical stoner, so I figured I could expect a laid-back atmosphere. Dave introduced me to his friend, who we'll call Tom. Tom led us to the lounge, where two girls were sitting and laughing while smoking. One of them looked fairly average. Let's call her Jane. The other had dreadlocks, cargo pants, and a very hippie-like vibe. Let's call her Rosie. I ended up spending the next couple of hours with them. They all seemed nice enough. The place was warm, my phone was charged, and there was plenty of weed and alcohol going around. Considering where I had started my morning, I wasn't complaining. Turns out Jane was Tom's sister, and Rosie was Tom's girlfriend. At one point, Jane announced she was going to take a bath and left the room. About 20 minutes later, Rosie got up and left too, without saying anything. Not long after, Tom followed. After a while, I asked Dave where they all went. He said, "They're taking a bath." I paused and asked, "They?" He nodded and said, "Yeah, come on." He got up and led me to the bathroom. I was reluctant to go, but he kept calling me in, so I followed. Sure enough, Tom, his sister Jane, and his girlfriend Rosie were all in the bathtub together. I was stunned, but I tried to act like it wasn't a big deal. Dave then started undressing and got in as well. Rosie looked at me and said, "Come on, get in."